In a peaceful and affluent suburb, where the grand houses line up behind perfectly trimmed hedges and the streets, flanked by elegant street lamps, seems straight out of a home decor magazine, Elliot pedals calmly on his bike. This 16-year-old boy, tall for his age, with a straight back and a focused look, is returning from an intense basketball practice. The evening breeze gently blows through his hair, bringing a touch of coolness that soothes the heat from his exertion. His well-worn yet clean gym bag is slung over his back, a sign of how many times he's carried it after practice sessions, symbolizing his dedication to the sport. In his mind, the scenes from practice replay. The passes he could have perfected, the shots he made with precision, and the encouragements from his teammates echo in his memory. These thoughts accompany him, drawing a faint smile on his face. Despite the fatigue weighing down his legs, his features reflect a peaceful satisfaction, the contentment of an effort completed. Basketball isn't just a hobby for Elliot. It's a passion that fuels his dreams, a refuge where he channels his energy, and a discipline that structures his days. Elliot is a polite, calm, and respectful boy, qualities rooted in the upbringing he received from his parents, especially his mother, who plays a central role in his life and in their community. His mother, a charismatic and determined woman, is the mayor of the town. She embodies the perfect example of a committed leader, combining strength, empathy, and a deep sense of justice. Despite her professional responsibilities, she has always made her role as a mother a priority, ensuring that Elliot and his siblings grow up with solid values and a strong sense of duty. She taught Elliot that respect and kindness are not only personal virtues, but essential pillars for building a better society. Being kind to others is a way of showing them they matter, even when the world ignores them, she often repeats to him. As mayor, she actively advocates for inclusion and equality, principles she passes on to her children through both words and, most importantly, actions. Elliot deeply admires his mother, not only for her public successes, but also for how she stays grounded in human values. He sees her as a model of resilience and commitment, which inspires him to honor his upbringing. On the basketball court, he applies these lessons by encouraging his teammates and staying humble, even in victory. His father, though more discreet, complements this education by teaching the importance of hard work and self-respect. Together, his parents form a solid team that inspires Elliot to pursue his dreams while staying true to his values. As Elliot pedals quietly, his thoughts still absorbed in practice, he enters a particularly upscale street. The wide sidewalks lined with perfectly trimmed trees and luxury cars parked in front of wrought iron gates evoke a world where order and calm reign supreme. Elliot has taken this route simply because it is the most direct path home, but from the very first few meters, he feels a slight unease settle in. The flawless facades of the houses seem almost to stare at him, just like some of the residents. Behind drawn curtains or open windows, curious, sometimes suspicious glances follow his progress. An elderly lady with a wrinkled face, sitting on a deck chair in her garden, briefly interrupts her reading to squint in his direction. A man in a suit, bringing in his trash can, casts a quick glance before turning his eyes away, but not before silently assessing him. Elliot tries not to pay attention. He keeps his head up, hands firmly on the handlebars, focusing on his journey. But it's difficult to ignore the feeling of being watched, judged, perhaps even unwelcome. Every furtive glance, every tense face he passes, weighs down the air around him. Among these onlookers is Mrs. Morell, a white woman in her 40s, standing proudly on the steps of her large house. Dressed neatly, her appearance exudes success and self-control, but her gaze betrays something else. When she spots Elliot, a shadow crosses her face. Her features freeze in an almost instinctive expression of suspicion, as if the mere presence of this young black boy on her territory triggers a silent alarm within her. Her mind immediately races, and an unfounded anxiety settles in. What is he doing here? She wonders, her brows furrowing slightly. This isn't a face she recognizes, and in this neighborhood, where everyone knows everyone, that's enough to stir her suspicions. She watches Elliot intently, searching for a justification for his presence, but her mind, influenced by unconscious biases, doesn't need any real proof. Absorbed in his ride, Elliot doesn't notice Mrs. Morell's expression or how she watches him, almost like an intruder. He doesn't yet know that this gaze, heavy with distrust, will be the catalyst for a series of unjust events that will turn this peaceful path into a disturbing chapter of his young life. Convinced that Elliot has no business in this upscale neighborhood, that he is there for some dubious reason, Mrs. Morell gives free rein to her prejudices without hesitation. Her mind, fed by deeply ingrained stereotypes, transforms the simple presence of a black teenager into a threat. Standing on her steps, she watches Elliot ride away, but instead of turning away and resuming her day, she feels an irrational urgency growing within her, an unjustified fear that she confuses with intuition. Firmly convinced that action is necessary, she grabs her phone and dials the police number with a speed that reflects her sense of certainty. Her voice takes on an urgent, almost alarmed tone, as if she were reporting a real emergency. "Yes, hello. I want to report an incident," she begins, the words slipping easily from her mouth, despite their falsehood. She casts one last glance in Elliot's direction, his bike now barely visible at the end of the street, and adjusts her story to capture the attention of the authorities. "There's a young man, suspicious, hanging around our neighborhood," she insists, carefully choosing her words to provoke an immediate reaction. The word suspicious, heavy with connotations, does its work. But Mrs. Morell doesn't stop there. She adds more, amplifying every detail to ensure her call is taken seriously. "He looks shady, really. He's hanging around here for no apparent reason," she continues, her tone now tinged with false gravity. "He could be planning something. I've never seen him here before, and I know everyone around here." Her imagination runs wild as she speaks, painting a fictional picture where Elliot becomes a menacing figure. She ends her call with insistence, demanding the police come quickly. "We need someone here right away. You know, with everything happening these days, you can never be too careful." As she hangs up, Mrs. Morell feels a cold satisfaction, convinced that she has acted in the best interest of her neighborhood. However, she has only set off a chain of events based on prejudice and assumptions, events that will have far more serious consequences than she could have imagined. Unaware of the commotion he has caused behind the windows and gates of the grand houses, Elliot pedals peacefully, enjoying the cool breeze on his face after his basketball practice. His fatigue mixes with a feeling of freedom as he rides through these quiet streets, lulled by the soft sound of his bike wheels on the asphalt. His thoughts are far from the heavy glances following him in silence, and even farther from the unjust assumptions swirling in the minds of some of the residents. Elliot has no idea that his mere presence in this neighborhood has triggered an invisible yet dangerous storm. The color of his skin, combined with the fact that he is not a familiar face in this upscale enclave, has raised unfounded suspicions. He has no inkling that, just a few streets away, police officers may already be en route, alerted by a misleading and erroneous call. For him, this path is just another road, a convenient shortcut to get home faster and enjoy some rest after a busy day. Meanwhile, Mrs. Morell returns to the cozy comfort of her living room. The golden light of the setting sun filters through the large bay windows, illuminating the luxurious furniture and carefully arranged objects. She sits in her favorite chair, a book in hand, but her mind remains alert, recalling the call she'd just made. A feeling of satisfaction washes over her. She silently congratulates herself for acting quickly, convinced she has fulfilled her duty by protecting her neighborhood. But what she perceives as an act of civic vigilance is, in reality, deeply rooted in prejudices she has never questioned. She doesn't see a tired yet happy teenager returning home after a productive day. She only sees an anomaly, a foreign body in a setting she considers her own, a threat completely fabricated by her own irrational fears. She doesn't think about the potential consequences of her actions, the dangers she may have inadvertently created for Elliot. For her, the matter is settled. She turns a page in her book, sipping a hot tea, convinced she acted in the best interests of her community. But in reality, She has set off a chain of events that could not only disrupt the life of an innocent teenager, but also challenge the image of serenity and justice this peaceful neighborhood claims to represent. Elliot, still unaware of the commotion he has set in motion, continues to pedal, simply trying to get home. But suddenly, the roar of police car engines makes him jump. In an instant, a patrol pulls up sharply beside him, blocking the road ahead. Two officers, a man and a woman, quickly get out, their gazes fixed on him with an intensity he doesn't understand. Elliot's heart races slightly, but he shows no sign of it. He stops, dismounts from his bike, standing tall, trying to understand what's happening. One of the officers, a man in his 30s with a stern look, orders him to move toward them. "What are you doing here?" he asks, without any prior explanation, his voice dry and authoritative. Elliot, caught off guard but still calm, responds politely. "I'm just heading home after basketball practice. I'm not doing anything wrong." But his calm tone and respectful attitude seem to raise even more suspicion. The female officer, who had been watching him silently until now, frowns. She doesn't seem convinced, and an air of suspicion hangs around them. "We saw you hanging around the neighborhood. Do you live here?" she asks, her tone almost accusatory. Elliot is caught off guard by the question. "No, but my house is nearby. I'm just passing through." He tries to stay calm, but he feels a growing pressure, a tension tightening around his throat. "I'll just continue on my way," he adds, trying to lighten the situation. But the officers don't seem in any rush to let him go. The man takes a step toward him, his scrutinizing gaze never leaving the young boy. "I'm going to need to check your ID," he says, his tone leaving no room for objection. Elliot, though surprised and frustrated, obeys without protest. He pulls out his phone and shows his address, hoping this will be enough to clarify the situation. The incident begins to draw the attention of the neighbors. A few windows quietly open, curious gazes peeking out, and soon a small crowd forms at a distance. Heads appear behind curtains, doors crack open, and whispers start to circulate. Among them, Mrs. Morell stands on her porch, watching the scene with an expression that mixes satisfaction and silent authority. She feels validated in her actions, convinced that her decision to call the police was justified. Her eyes follow every movement of the officers, and she allows herself to relax slightly, reassured that the situation seems to be unfolding just as she imagined it would. She notices the neighbors around her, some sneaking glances, others moving closer for a better view. The scene takes on a theatrical air, a tableau where the young boy seems to be the object of their curiosity, but also their silent judgment. Mrs. Morell, while remaining calm and discreet, lets a slight sense of satisfaction appear on her face. She feels secure in the belief that she has protected the integrity of her neighborhood, that her citizen gesture has prevented an invisible threat. Yet, deep down, a veil of doubt lingers. But she chooses to ignore it, preferring to focus on the apparent normalcy of the situation. On the other side, Elliot stands still, his bike resting beside him, while the officers continue to stare at him with suspicion. A ball of anxiety grows in his stomach, making his breath a little shallow. He clenches his fists to hide his sweaty palms, hoping to project an image of calm that he doesn't feel. In his mind, a multitude of thoughts rushes. Why me? What did I do? What if this escalates? He glances furtively around him, noting the faces of the curious onlookers. Each pair of eyes fixed on him feels heavier on his shoulders. This feeling of being scrutinized, judged, is familiar to him, but it has never been this intense. He feels his heart race as the silence stretches on, broken only by the low voices of the officers exchanging information about his address and identity. He mentally repeats the advice his parents have always given him. Stay polite. Never raise your voice. Explain your situation calmly. Lessons they instilled in him, not because he had a tendency to be insolent, but because they knew that, for him, a young black man, any interaction with authority could be misinterpreted. Yet, in this moment, even these lessons seem insufficient in the face of the palpable tension surrounding him. The weight of injustice tightens around his chest. He hasn't done anything wrong, nothing to deserve the situation, yet here he is having to justify himself, having to prove that he has the right to be in this space. One of the officers steps toward him again, his gaze still filled with distrust. "So, where exactly do you live? And why are you passing through here?" he asks, his voice betraying both skepticism and a hint of annoyance. Elliot takes a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor he feels rising in his voice. "I live a few streets away, officer. It's just a shortcut. I'm heading home after basketball practice." He gestures lightly toward his gym bag, hoping that this simple argument will be enough to dissipate the situation. But the officer's expression remains closed, and Elliot feels his explanations fall into a void ruled by prejudice. He tries not to look at the crowd that's slowly gathering, but he feels their gazes like invisible weights on his neck. Mrs. Morell is still there, standing upright and still on her porch, arms crossed, a satisfied expression on her face. Elliot quickly averts his eyes, refusing to let his frustration take over. Despite his efforts to remain stoic, a quiet anger begins to bubble within him. He knows it's dangerous, that it would only make things worse, but it's there, lurking beneath the surface. An injustice like this, he's experienced it too many times, and he knows the unspoken rules. They see you as guilty before you even open your mouth. But despite everything, Elliot refuses to give in to fear or anger. He squares his shoulders, lifts his chin, and holds the officer's gaze. He knows he must remain dignified, even in this humiliation. Because deep down, he knows one thing: he hasn't done anything wrong. And that truth, as simple as it is his only strength in this moment. But the atmosphere changes dramatically when Claire Fontenay, Elliot's mother and a respected mayor of the city, receives a panicked call from a neighbor who witnessed the scene. In no time, Claire, known for her poise and sense of justice, decides to intervene. She drops everything, gets into her car, and heads toward the upscale neighborhood where her son is facing a blatant injustice. When she arrives, the whispers of the neighbors intensify. Claire is a public figure admired for her exemplary management of the city and her dedication to promoting equality and justice. Today, however, she is not here as the mayor, but as an outraged mother. Dressed elegantly in a suit that underscores her natural authority, she steps out of her car with confidence. Her heels click sharply on the pavement as she approaches the scene. Her presence immediately imposes silence among the crowd. The officers, previously firm in their authoritative stance, freeze when they recognize the silhouette of the mayor. Claire wastes no time. Her eyes scan the scene, her son, standing next to his bike, visibly tense but dignified, the police officers, uncomfortable, and Mrs. Morell, still perched on her porch, watching with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Can I know what's going on here?" Claire asks in a calm but firm voice. Each word is articulated precisely, and although she does not raise her tone, her authority is overwhelming. The officers exchange nervous glances, unsure how to respond. One of them, clearly uneasy, speaks up. "Madam Mayor, we received a call regarding suspicious activity in the neighborhood. We're conducting a routine check." Claire slightly narrows her eyes, her expression betraying contained anger. "Suspicious activity? My son, coming home after practice, is suspicious activity," she asks, her tone still composed but laden with cold indignation. The second officer, a woman, awkwardly tries to explain. "It was a false alarm, Madam Mayor. We didn't mean to." "A false alarm?" Claire interrupts. She turns toward Elliot, examining him with a mix of tenderness and pain. Then she fixes her gaze back on the officers. "Do you know how many young people like him experience this kind of humiliation every day? How many of them have to prove their innocence simply because they don't look like what some consider legitimate?" The officers lower their eyes, caught in the eloquence and moral force of Claire. The crowd, captivated by the scene, begins to murmur. Some neighbors seem uncomfortable, averting their eyes, while others, clearly moved by her words, nod in approval. Mrs. Morell, meanwhile, turns pale. She never imagined the young boy she had so hastily judged was the mayor's son. The realization hits her like a thunderclap. Her posture, once straight and confident, falters slightly. She tries to retreat quietly, moving slowly back into her house, as if she could escape Claire's gaze and the palpable indignation of the crowd. But Claire, with impressive calm and unshakable confidence, calls out to her before she can slip away. "Mrs. Morell," she says, her voice resonating with authority. "Stay, please. Perhaps we should discuss the consequences of your actions." Claire takes a few steps forward, her piercing eyes fixed on the woman, who stops, frozen like an animal caught in headlights. "You took the liberty of making unfounded accusations," Claire continues, each word heavy with meaning. "Endangering an innocent young man who committed no crime except passing through this street. Do you realize what this could have caused?" Silence settles. The crowd holds its breath. Mrs. Morell opens her mouth to respond, but no sound comes out. Her lips tremble slightly, and her cheeks, once flushed with satisfaction, turn pale. The confidence she had displayed earlier crumbles under the weight of Claire's stinging words. She begins weakly, but Claire interrupts with a glance. "You have nothing to say, do you? Yet you didn't hesitate to call the police and exaggerate your suspicions without ever questioning your own biases." Claire pauses, studying Mrs. Morell as if giving her time to understand the full extent of her actions. "I want you to think about that, Mrs. Morell. What you call citizen vigilance is actually an act driven by fear and intolerance. You nearly ruined a day, or worse, a life of a young man, simply because you decided he didn't belong here." Mrs. Morell lowers her eyes, unable to meet Claire's piercing gaze. The neighbors, who had been discreet until now, begin to exchange murmurs, some nodding in agreement with the mayor's words. Claire continues, her voice still calm but tinged with solemn gravity. "You've had the privilege of living in this neighborhood without ever fearing to be judged for your appearance or your existence. Do you think that gives you the right to deny that same safety to others? To a 16-year-old boy who only wanted to go home?" Mrs. Morell, visibly shaken, mutters a feeble apology. I didn't mean to. I just thought." "You thought, but you didn't know," Claire interrupts, cutting her off sharply, but still measured. "Next time, Mrs. Morell, I advise you to think twice before acting. Because this city, my city, will not be a place where intolerance is accepted or excused." A heavy silence falls over the gathering. Claire steps back slightly, leaving Mrs. Morell to face her own shame. Then, turning toward the neighbors, she concludes in a loud, clear voice, "It is our collective responsibility to ensure that everyone feels safe here, no matter their appearance. If we cannot respect this, then we fail as a community." The officers, realizing the magnitude of their mistake and feeling the weight of the situation, offer awkward apologies. One of them, visibly uncomfortable, steps forward, his cap in his hands, and says, "We're sorry, Madam Mayor. We misinterpreted the situation." His voice trembles slightly, aware that his explanation, no matter how sincere, is inadequate given the gravity of their actions. Claire nods, but her gaze remains hard, sharp like a well-honed blade. "Misinterpreted," she repeats in a chilling tone. "No, gentlemen. This wasn't a mere mistake. What you did stems from a deeply rooted bias, a prejudice that could have cost my son dearly, and that costs so many others every day." The officers lower their eyes, avoiding her gaze. Claire, still standing tall, gives them no respite. "I will make sure this mistake, as you call it, doesn't happen again," she declares in a clear, firm voice, each word striking like a hammer blow. "My office will be in contact with your superior first thing tomorrow. And, believe me, there will be accountability." A heavy silence settles over the scene. Even the neighbors, drawn in by the tension and the spectacle, feel the weight of Claire's words. She scans them briefly, her eyes moving from one face to the next, as if reminding each person that the responsibility for this injustice doesn't rest solely on the shoulders of the officers. She turns back to them, but this time, her tone becomes slightly more measured. "I still believe in the ability of law enforcement to protect and serve, but that can only happen if you commit to examining your practices and correcting your biases. You represent the law. Your actions must reflect exemplary impartiality. Anything less is unacceptable. The officer who had spoken first nods, unable to find the right words. We understand, Madam Mayor. We will take the necessary steps to correct this. Claire, after one last hard look at the officers, turns away with unwavering dignity and walks toward Elliot, who is standing a little off to the side, looking both relieved and full of gratitude. His face, marked by palpable tension, relaxes as he sees her approach. Claire places a comforting hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture, but one full of support and love. You didn't do anything wrong, my son, she says in a soft voice, but loud enough for everyone present to hear. Her words echo in the air, a solemn reminder that injustice should never define a life. Let's go home. She waits for her son to get in the car before sliding behind the wheel. The doors close, isolating the two of them in a cocoon of silence, but a silence filled with mutual understanding and strength. Claire gives one last look at the slowly dispersing crowd, their eyes still on her, most of them realizing that they've just witnessed a moment of justice and dignity in the face of social injustice. She takes a deep breath, her eyes still fixed on the road ahead as the car slowly pulls away. In this simple scene, Claire leaves behind much more than just a confrontation. She leaves a silent but powerful lesson. A lesson on the courage to stand up to injustice, the importance of staying true to one's principles even in the face of attacks, and the conviction that human dignity, when defended with integrity, will always triumph over prejudice and oppression. As she drives, the low sun casting a soft light on the city, Claire, eyes on the road, murmurs to Elliot, more to herself than to him, this won't be the last time. But as long as we're together, we'll resist. Elliot, moved by the strength of her words, nods without saying a word, knowing that this moment, this drive home, will be forever etched in their memories. But he also knows that this is just the beginning. Their fight, the one for justice and equality, has only just begun. And with his mother by his side, he knows they will never lose in the face of injustice.